Welcome everybody to this edition of our online technical workshop. This is yet another exciting and enlightening edition. If you have joined before, I'm sure you would know how always enlightening and informative it is. If this is your first time, be ready to be captivated by some interesting things you will be hearing. Maybe for the first time, or even if for a second time or a third time, I'm sure you will be intrigued regardless. And so we have today Brian Douglas, who is a staff developer advocate at GitHub. And today he will be sharing how to use GraphQL API to build integrations. So Brian Douglas is a developer advocate at GitHub, where he works with the increasing use of GitHub's platform-specific features through technical content distributed on the internet. In addition to that, Brian has a passion for open source and loves mentoring new contributors. Awesome. Yet again, another opportunity for networking if you want to take advantage of that. So Brian, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks for the introduction too as well. And folks, I'm super honored and privileged to be talking with Andela. Once again, this is probably the third time I've actually done an event with y'all, second workshop. And as mentioned, I work at GitHub. I am a developer advocate. I'm focused on talk about features like GitHub Actions and talk about the API, talk about GitHub Apps, talk about code spaces, talk about all those features that we're talking about in next week that we're going to be shipping. I'm just honored to be able to talk about those in these situations. Also, just housekeeping for this, how this will run. I do have slides, which I'll share, and I'll be going from slides to examples. These workshops and being remote, I've found a couple different ways that work, and I find this being able to share the information and give you links always being the best way than have you follow along with me, because I do find like only maybe a handful of you will follow along, and the rest of you will save the links for later. So I'll mainly just be telling and showing, so no need to open up VS Code or anything like that. But I did want to point out this. I'm going to talk about this project towards the middle of it. But this is my website. This is BW Live. This is where a lot of my content, my quote unquote digital garden is. It actually lives here. And it's something I've been working on just this year, as of like April, March, decided to improve my personal website and create this. And the one thing I wanted to point out real quick is that all these posts here, normally you have blog posts. The way I have these posts working is you can click through and you can view this as a GitHub issue. So all my posts are actually GitHub issues on this repo. So I bring this up because I'm going to be talking about using the GitHub GraphQL API. And this is one way that I'm using the GitHub GraphQL API is actually create blog posts for my website that live here. So if you go to and added a reaction here, you can actually see the reaction updates. Well, it should update. It's using serverless functions to update. It looks like it's not updating. Oh, you know what? I need to actually log in. That's why. But that's part of the integration is actually logging into GitHub. So you just saw the celebration emoji. I'm not sure what this party thing is, but that is updated. And we'll talk about this in a moment. I also want to point out on my YouTube channel, I will have a video, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, talking about how to build this from scratch and how you can use the GitHub platform integrations and API to make this for yourself. Unfortunately, because of this event, actually GitHub Universe, because I've been doing a lot of preparation for this, this has taken all my time. So I wanted to actually have the video series done by this talk so I could point you to it, but I didn't have it. I didn't have bandwidth to finish it. But I do highly recommend. This is a free event. It's going to be happening next Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And we're going to have 2 different time zones. I think the first one probably more beneficial for you, which is going to be the American time zones. The other one's going to be APAC friendly. So depending on if you want to wake up early or stay up late, there's time for you to catch up and see all the features we're shipping and all the stuff I'll be talking about in the next 3-6 months probably, and all the content I'll be growing on. All right. So with that introduction, let me jump into some slides and talk about the GitHub developer experience and the GraphQL API and sort of like the decisions we made with GitHub. Before we jumped, like when we started and waiting for people to jump on, I asked, how many of you have used GraphQL? How many of you are familiar with it? I'm actually going to ask the second question, which is how many of you have built something with the GitHub API, just in general? Ever leveraged the API, did anything with it? Integration, GitHub Action is also another way to use the API. So just put in the chat yes or no. Maybe tell me a little bit about the example that you did. I got the chat open. I also want to mention too, I'm not going to go really into detail at the beginning of GraphQL and how it all works. It interacts with queries, mainly because there's a lot of content out there, and I want to make sure that we have opportunity to look at examples and see what you can do with it, and not focus too much on the beginning experience, because I think there's a lot of beginning talks out there, and I want to make sure that you could do the beginning talk, how to GraphQL.com, and go to that content, and then you could take the stuff that I've shown you if you aren't familiar with GraphQL and go build that yourself. So. I work at this company called GitHub, which you're more than likely familiar if you're a developer, if you've gone through any sort of program, CS programs, boot camps. GitHub is a platform where collaboration of developers across the world. I've got coworkers across the world in Australia. I've got coworkers in Ireland. So like I'm up, like it's early for me right now in Oakland. Actually, Oakland represent. Oakland, it's right now 7 a.m. And I'm pretty used to waking up this early because my manager is actually already up. He's been up for 6 hours. So a lot of times we'll connect around this time and have our one-on-ones. But enough about GitHub. You're familiar with GitHub probably. 50 million developers worldwide. And I like to switch slides, but I like to say that I am a developer advocate. Sometimes I say I'm a Beyonce advocate because we have so many developers worldwide. Beyonce she's got a lot of super fans. GitHub has a lot of super fans. If you want to know anything about me, I showed my website, BW Live. Twitter, as mentioned before, you can mention me. Reach out to me. I do answer a lot of DMs. DMs have got really, really busy as of late, thanks to Twitter fleets. But hit me up. I'm happy to answer questions, point you to tutorials, point you to places where you can get mentorship if you just want to get into open source, if you just want to get into GraphQL. I guess I'm well connected, similar to Beyonce, who's Queen Bee. So again, I joke that I'm the Beyonce of GitHub, and for good reason, because I feel like I do make a lot of connections. I do I bring a lot of people else up, which I know a lot of people here because you want to level up in things like GraphQL. And I'd make that joke that I go to bat for the Hive as well, which if you don't know Beyonce's Lemonade, you should definitely listen to it. Fun fact, one of my coworkers, so Spotify has been sitting at the end of the year, like what songs you listen to. And one of my coworkers is number 4 of the most listened, the person who's listened to Beyonce the most of all of Spotify. She's it. And I'm kind of jealous. I need to actually start putting that on repeat so I can make it to the top 10 list next year. But I bring this year up, 2017. 2017 is the year I got into GraphQL. 2017 is the year that GraphQL went into public, out of public alpha into beta. From Facebook. GraphQL actually started out of Facebook as a need to solve one of their technical problems. We don't have to get into that. If you go to how to GraphQL, they'll actually explain that for you. A lot of talks that are out there, but essentially GraphQL solved sort of the data flow problem that they were having and try to grabbing data for all their client services at Facebook. But I bring this up because GitHub took a gamble. I don't know if it was really a gamble, but they took a chance and sampled GraphQL. And what they did is, when I say this, GitHub's API has been around for as long as GitHub. So a couple months after GitHub was launched 12 years ago, actually at this point it's 13 years. 13 years ago, GitHub launched their API, and it's been around as long as GitHub's been around. So I bring that up because their APIs, it's leveraged by tools like Circle, it's leveraged like tools like anything that integrates like Netlify or Vercel. They all integrate with GitHub's API. So if you want to build a platform, you want to connect to developers, one of the easiest ways to do that is at the pull request time, build an integration to connect to developers. And that's what the stuff I'll be talking about in a moment. But this is when the public GraphQL API was launched. And GitHub is probably the most used public GraphQL API. At this point, there's quite a few out there. And I'll show you a tool, actually, if you want to sort of have an aggregate of seeing what APIs you can use to build products and projects. Highly recommend, if you have an idea, like build it. What I did, actually, I'll get in, it's a couple slides later, why I use GraphQL, but I had an idea for a project. That's how I learned GraphQL. And that's actually the best way to learn. Going through tutorials like how to GraphQL is definitely good. Definitely do it once at least. but I quickly move on to building something that you can actually have tangible access and understanding of how it works. So that's the GitHub GraphQL API. The reason why GitHub chose GraphQL because they wanted to provide more flexibility to integrators. Integrators as in, like I mentioned, Netlify and Vercel, like building integrations into GitHub's platform to connect to that developer. So when I push my code to production or to the main branch in my project, other stuff can happen. Like I can deploy to staging, I can deploy to production, I can deploy to anywhere I want. I can deploy to the Apple App Store if I wanted to as well. Technically, there are some pipelines and tools that people have done to automate that. Haven't actually used them, but I know Android actually has one, which is probably a little more forethought and a little more open of an ecosystem. But yeah, the real clear goals of having a public API and using GraphQL, if I didn't iterate that enough, is flexibility for the integrators. One of the things flexibility is that I like using a lot is actions. So GitHub Actions it's like a culmination of a bunch of different primitives of GitHub. So when I build an integration for GitHub, for example, that site you just saw, my site where you can comment and leave and react to my post, which are literally GitHub issues, that is my integration. So not only can you log in to GitHub from my site and do integrations and do comments based on your GitHub account, but you can read my content, and that's pretty much all you can do. I haven't really built any other features, but more features are coming. But what I'm getting at is that all that stuff is actually bundled together into one package, which for that's a GitHub app. But with GitHub Actions, it's very similar. The only difference is actions are embedded directly in your repos, and apps are actually full-on applications that you can build on top of GitHub. So we can talk more about that. Also, feel free to ask questions. Have me slow down. If you've never heard of actions, never heard of apps, I'm happy to slow down and jump in and explain stuff too as well. Like this is your time. Like I know we do have a limited time for me to speak, but I want to make sure that you get the best value out of this. This is definitely an opportunity for you. So I talk about GraphQL because GraphQL gives us those integrations. It gives us better hooks into the API. With an API being around for so long, you're going to have inconsistencies. Like you're going to have, like I've got coworkers that no longer work on GitHub. They work in new teams, new companies. Like people come and go. Flavors of how you write code changes over years. Like people figure out better ways to do things. So this is an example of an issue that OctaKit was actually having a problem where there was just so many inconsistency of the API. So like if I delete something, if I delete a record, the response that comes back was all inconsistent. If I open up an issue or if I open a pull request, sometimes the date format can be different. So I can get a completely different date format for issues versus pull requests. And this across the board, this is a lot of inconsistencies with the GitHub's REST API. And the reason why we chose GraphQL is because you can actually enforce those consistencies across the board. And it's the stuff that on the sort of back end and the sort of schema designers and back end developers or API designers, they make those decisions and they can make those decisions on the fly with elegant deprecations, which again, like I can't go into all the details of how GraphQL like wins and does well for us. But I did want to mention that I did a podcast, and one of the reasons why I work at GitHub is because I was introduced to Kyle and gave a talk at GitHub Universe as well about the GraphQL API. And this conversation, which is episode 5 of my podcast with Jamstack Radio, you're more than welcome to listen to that if you want to get the whole introduction story of why GitHub chose GraphQL and that sort of flexibility as well. So definitely check it out. The other thing I want to talk about is it hooks into our documentation. So with GitHub, our API, it's a giant reference doc. It's got a lot of endpoints, and the best way I always joke, and I joke, but it's serious. The best way for me to learn the GitHub GraphQL API back in 2017 was to literally ask the person next to me, like the engineer that I was working with, my boss, the person who solved the problem before me, because GitHub's documentation is so dense and the API was so dense. It was basically, if you know what you're looking for, you can get stuff done. But if you have no idea what you're looking for, it's hard to get stuff done. And with GraphQL, you can kind of have, and I'll show you this in a second, you can kind of have a half idea of like what you're looking to accomplish and find it much faster than the previous ways, which again, like the concept of, and not a lot of people know this, excuse me, but GitHub issues, the way GitHub issues are built, they're actually the same thing as pull requests. So pull requests in the database are actually GitHub issues. They have very similar attributes. And when you go to fetch issues inside of the GitHub, when you go to fetch issues inside of the GitHub API, they're actually, when you fetch pull requests in the GitHub API, they're actually issues. And that's something that you just don't know unless you get there. And there's a couple of times that I've actually tripped up on that. And it's because my former boss at my previous employer, he used to work at GitHub, and he told me all about the API and told me all the decisions they made. And I was like, oh, this all makes sense. But like, I would have never known that if I didn't ask him. So the cool thing about the GraphQL API is that you have the GraphQL Explorer, and it gives you all the data inline right there in front of you. So this is the GraphQL the Explorer, which is actually embedded in our GitHub documentation, where the benefit of this is that you don't need to do anything other than just sign in with your GitHub account, and you could start querying data. So when I'm talking about building a project right away, like this is kind of hands down one of the best things you could do is just query some data and see if you can build an app around it. And that's what I did. So I'm able to query repo issues for my open source repo, and then I get that data right there. So I can see what the data looks like. And that's the one thing I missed, and I deleted the slide, but GraphQL actually lets you define the shape of the data that you want, and then returns that data back to you. And I'll talk about that more in a sec. But what I really wanted to talk real quick before I jump into a demo is the documentation. The documentation here is directly in line next to the query that you're actually looking for. So if you don't know if it's like repo issues or repo data or like whatever the name is, like you can just search it right here in the documentation, which is beautiful. So real quick, I just wanted to show this off as part of the Explorer. Yep, there we go. So once you go into the Explorer, so developer.github.com/v4/explorer, feel free to play around with that and check it out. I'm just returning myself. Like it's not a ton of data, but the cool thing about this is like I could also return all my repositories. So if I just want all my first 10 repositories, because I might want to know what that is, I can see now I have 10 repositories. So normally the way this would work is you would have to hit one endpoint to get your user data, and then you have to hit a second endpoint to get your repository data. And if you want to get repository information, depending on what information is available in repositories, which is plural, you might have to hit a third endpoint to then get specifically repository name. If you want to get stars, stargazers, you can actually get that as well. So you want to see how many stars. Actually, did I? Oh, you know what? See, and this is the other thing. I messed up, and I'm pulling back stargazers, which is actually, these are people who have starred my project. So I can get a list of people who did star my project. But because GitHub, we have a limit, and this is stuff that I figured out just by using the GraphQL API and popping over the documentation and understanding that stargazers, it's an array of data. So they call them edges in GraphQL. But I bring this up because you can only pull back 100 stars per pool. So then you have to get into pagination at that point. But that was something I learned just by searching the documentation. It's clearly, once I click there, it has this first. So you have to return the first n elements. And then if you dig in deep enough, you'll find where edges are explained. And then they'll explain that you need the first. You have to identify that you have to have something less than 100 there. So now you could see I've got stargazers, which a lot of my projects have 0 stars. So that's very sad, kind of a sad example. So my first 10 projects that I've created, very few of them have stars, which is fine because they're all pretty much garbage projects. But I wasn't trying this. The beauty of this is I wasn't even trying to do stargazers. I actually wanted to do total star count, which I think would be, oh yeah, that's what it is. Stargazer count. And this is actually the information I was looking for. So you can see I've got 1 star on my postmarks project, which is one of my earlier projects, like one of my earlier tutorial projects. So actually, this is not as useful. So what I'll just do is my last 10, because my last 10 projects are a little more popular. And I say that out loud because they're actually not popular. I've got 0 stars on all these projects, except this one. I've got 113 here, which is amazing. But what I'm getting at is that the data that I'm pulling back here, I can then take this and go build a project like this. And now I can have an entire list of all the issues on my BDucky Live project. And I didn't point this out, but here I've got bducky/live. That's the project that's hosting my website. And that's also the project that's hosting my issues as blog posts. So if I went back here and said, if I want this data, and I encourage you to all to try this out, either now or later, it's all good. I'm gonna look for repository name live. And I think a lot of times I'm not even sure what I'm doing. So I kind of always just look for if there's any error messages in line. And you'd also prettify that. And then I could get issues. And again, these are going to be an array of issues. So I'll need to get in the first. I only have 10 issues, but I'll grab the first 100 just in case. And then I got a parsing error. Issues first. Oh, yeah, that's what it is. I'll need to. That's interesting. Now I'm throwing myself off. Unexpected end of the document. Yeah, so I've got something off. But you know what? Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the Explorer real quick. I'm sort of trying to guess on what the GraphQL shape looks like. But what's cool about this is I can actually just go into user, and then which will then get my user query. And this is all built inside of the GraphQL Explorer API. So this is the same data that I was bringing back before. And if I wanted to look for repositories, I don't have to guess on what the data looks like. And now I can get the ID, which is, that gives me that by default. The one thing I wanted is issues. So I'm just clicking through, and this real quick, I'm just looking at the first 10 issues. Might as well just do that one. So you can see that was populated here. And now I get the first 10 issues. And within the first 10 years, so like the Explorer itself, again, normally what I would do to get this data is go into the GraphQL, the REST API documentation. I would search for issues. I would find the endpoint for issues. I would return that as a fetch request. I would take that data. I would filter it. I would then sort it. I didn't present that on the page. And then when I wanted to get the repo data, like if I want to get stars or anything like that, I go to the star endpoint. I'd fetch that. I would sort that. I would filter it. I would present it on the data. The beauty of this is I'm actually just getting the data in line too as well. So I don't know why I'm getting the ID, but for whatever reason, it's not name. Oh, title. That's why. All right. So I keep typing name for issue and it's not showing up. It's because it's title. And if I search the documentation, I would actually get that. So you can see now I have the titles of each one of my issues. I'm also noticing I'm getting some closed issues. So what I'll do is I want the state to be open. And this is all, I'm doing this off the fly. Actually, expect the name state. And I'm sort of guessing on this data real quick. But what I'll do is instead of guess, I'll just click on state and it'll actually give me the proper state. There we go. So yeah, state is closed, but I want only states, which I'm going to filter on this. So this little parentheses here is actually filtering the data. And I know that I want only open stuff. So then now I got open issues. So this is the query right here that's actually populating all this data. And this is a Next.js app. It's a React app, and it's presenting that data here. So I'm able to take this query and I'm able to take this query, copy it, and then pull that into my database. So someone mentioned Gatsby as their sort of introduction to GraphQL. Like you could actually just take this, plop this right into your Gatsby site, and then you have data that's being returned. The other cool thing about it is having aliases. I think issues is a proper name that it can be. But if the data doesn't, like if what's being returned is not what you're looking to get, actually, I will need to, I can't do it on the filter, but I can do an alias of data, or blog post. These are technically not blog posts in the eyes of GitHub, but in the eyes of my project, I can return them as blog posts. When I am unexpected open, my aliasing, my syntax is off, and which is fine. But trust me, you could alias for whatever reason. I'm blanking. Maybe it's the live coding worries, but I'm going to move off from this demo because I actually spent a little more time than I thought I was going to on that. And I want to talk about the rest of the project's integrations. But if anybody, that was all interesting. And I don't know, Ani, if this will be recorded. I assume it will be recorded for folks to review later. So hopefully you can go back and check that out. So that was one example. That was me using the GraphQL API and the GraphQL Explorer. And that's me just sort of manipulating the data, just grabbing on the fly and sort of messing up as I can. But I just want to point out that even though it took me, as I was messing up and going to that, I would have messed up a lot more fetching data from REST API and then find out what I'm getting. And a lot of times you just feel like you're doing that blind. And I found as I was building a new project, so I built a project earlier back in 2017 to support my interest in GraphQL. This guy called Gucci Mane actually just did a versus. I think it was Young Jeezy. I was more of a Gucci Mane fan than Jeezy. But I think Jeezy's actually probably bigger. But I'm not sure if anybody's familiar versus. It's kind of anyway, doesn't matter. What I'm getting at is Gucci Mane. He's the trap. I call him the Burna Boy of trap music. Because he's the godfather of trap music. He kind of really started that sort of. He didn't invent it, but he really rode the wave. We can go back and forth later about who invented trap music. But there's a quote when he talks about if you don't got sauce, then you lost. And this is like the experience that I have. Like I just don't know what I don't know. And like with the GitHub API, I don't know how to find certain things. At least I didn't know in the past. Now I can I'm like a whiz with it at this point. But I love this quote because I felt that way with open source. Like I always wanted to get involved in open source, but you don't really know where to get started. A lot of people just tell you to just read the documentation, which is not helpful at all because one project's documentation can completely different to the other project's documentation. So I took the GraphQL API from GitHub and I built this project called Open Sauce. And Open Sauce it was just a platform for me to, one, use GraphQL, but two, be able to track my open source contributions. And at the moment, like I have a contribution I'm working on for Node.js. I've been working on it for way too long, but I've been keeping all my notes and all my connections, all the information inside this sort of CRM for open source. So that's really what it is. It's a simple project. It's not meant to, raise a bunch of funding or hire a bunch of people or whatever. It's just my personal project that I use to save notes for projects and then rediscover them later. But what I wanted to bring up, which this is Gucci Mane, I just wanted to learn how to use GraphQL API. So I did it. I built a project. I embedded GraphQL into my UI, and it was pretty much off to the races at that point. So this is sort of the structure of what that project is, and that project's open source too as well. So if you just want to look at the queries and everything like that, you can. They're all available for you. But the GitHub GraphQL API, I'm using that to fetch repo data. So technically, my backend, similar to the BW Live site, the entire backend is GitHub.com. My backend for the project has no database. It's a GitHub repo. So I just found that as a really nice, elegant way to not only get a way to test and work with the GitHub API, but also I don't have to pay for a database, which was great. So when I talk about, and this is very similar to BW Live, this project, I have a list of projects I'm following, and they're all stored as issues. This is a pattern that I have in the way I build projects, but I'm using GitHub issues as my backend. So you can see the CLI project that I'm following on the right. I'm also following it inside my dashboard, and it's just a one-to-one database creation that I'm using with GraphQL. The other thing I want to talk about is the thing about authentication in the GraphQL tooling. So there's a company called OneGraph. They're building a lot of tooling for GraphQL, and they're making it a lot easier to integrate. There's a couple other companies like Apollo, and I think I forget what the company is, but Urkel is another tool just like Apollo that you're able to consume your GraphQL API and get a bunch of features and integrations. There's a lot of other tools that you could leverage to just make your developer experience much better with GraphQL. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but I did want to talk about Auth Guardian because that's what my login. So when you went to BW Live, when I went to log in to respond to a reaction, that was Auth Guardian. That was taking my GitHub token and then providing GraphQL back for me to be able to leverage. Yeah, so hopefully that makes sense. I did see a question, made a simple integration required me to get a token from GitHub. How can allow others use a token in such a product without requiring tokens? You know, it's funny because that's literally my next slide. So this person is saying that they have a token for GitHub and they want other people to leverage that token. But I would be very cautious to like exposing that token to other people to use. So like when you log into BW Live, you're using my token, but you don't have access to my token because, and it's ironic that, or serendipitous that you asked that question right before the slide, because you can have persistent queries. So you can actually do a query to the GraphQL database, embed your token in the query, and protect that token from other people being able to use it for other reasons. So I just want to point out Relay. Relay is it's also produced by Facebook. It's an open source project, and you can actually consume that as well. Do you know if okay, I'll answer these questions in a moment because I think that question will be answered in the next slide too as well, the latest question. But yeah, persistent queries is something I don't have more time to go into. I have a whole talk on persistent queries. Not a lot of people talk about it. So if you just go to YouTube, youtube.com and look for persistent queries, I guarantee you will see a talk of me talking more in detail about it. Oh, you know what? Looks like somebody did a talk. Oh, that was a couple years ago. Here we go. This is me talking about persistent queries where I go into way more detail. I'm not sure what that is, but yeah, here we go. So yeah, GraphQL Enterprise Connect persistent queries, Brian Douglas. Definitely check that out. And let me go back to persistent queries real quick. Yeah, so that would be the answer for embedding the GraphQL token to be exposed to other people. Again, I have a whole talk about that. Now, caching, I'm able to get that away. I'm able to manage caching with persistent queries through Relay, which again is an open source project. Now, there's a question: do you know if React Apollo solves cache invalidation issue? Haven't followed it for some time. I haven't used React Apollo in some time either, mainly because I've been using Relay. So Relay and Apollo kind of do the same thing. Apollo has a lot more features. It's an actual project that's actually invested or funded by VC investment. Relay is an open source project that's maintained by open source contributors as well as some Facebook employees. So like it's not a very one-to-one comparison, but I find the cache invalidation and stuff with persistent queries very elegant, where I can actually set a TTL. I'm using OneGraph, which is a product that's also VC funded that actually gives me that for free as well. It's a free feature. So that actually has cache invalidation as well built in. So I do recommend that. And again, I go into way more detail on that talk I just shared if you want to get more detail there. If you say you have 2 REST services returning paginated data GraphQL servers seated between the client and those services, would it be sense to go ahead and repaginate the data at the GraphQL server? That's a architect question, and that is a good question. I don't have an answer for that right now, not understanding your project. So yeah, it's going to be based on your project. But I did want to point out the persistent query and how this works. I've got my GitHub token, which I don't have exposed in my code. This is actually taken directly from my open source project. So this is exactly what it looks like. And I have a how many seconds, which is 300 milliseconds, is how long I cache. Actually, these are actually not milliseconds. These are full on seconds. So this is, what is that, 3 minutes that it's going to cache. And I did this because the data that I receive from GitHub issues, it needs to be updated more frequently sometimes, especially if you're in the project. So I do actually update the cache and invalidate it sooner. And then the cache invalidation based on the persistent query then handles the rest. So if the data does change, it needs to be rehydrated. Not a fan of that term, but I'm going to use it in this case. Then you could actually invalidate the cache and get new, fresh data. So I wanted to talk, and I'm sort of winding down, and I can focus more on questions. I did take some time and went back and forth, but I want to talk about improving your GitHub experience with GitHub apps. And I mentioned actions. Apps are full-on embeddable projects inside of your repo. A lot of times our CI or continuous delivery projects will be GitHub apps, and they'll integrate inside of your project. And the best way to sort of explain this to introduce you to this is Probot. Probot is a wonderful project that gets you up and running to build GitHub apps pretty quickly, and allows you to automate workflows using the GitHub API. So automating workflows, like for one of the examples I use is you review a pull request probably once a day. If your team is shipping stuff on a regular basis, you want to take some time out of the day to review those PRs. So why not set up an automation tool to remind you, or automation tool to auto approve PRs that hit a certain criteria? One of the projects that we did, one of the projects that we worked on earlier this year is called the GitHub Hackathon. Again, I have kind of a weirdness where I use GitHub repos to do all the backend work for everything. What I'm mentioning is all these GitHub Hackathon submissions were all GitHub repos submitted into the project. And the way we did this is we had a bunch of automation set up inside this repo. So this is the repo that actually powers the site you just saw. And the way we did this is we set up automation to validate submissions. So this is actually technically a GitHub action. It's not actually a GitHub app, which I was just talking about, but the concept itself is still the same. I'm actually validating all submissions that get submitted on the website as pull requests that get added to a JSON file, and I'm able to validate those based on what is populated in the JSON. So it's an elegant way to work on that. And I just mentioned that because I wanted to provide a second example, or third example at this point, to talk about how you could sort of add in functionality from the API to make things a lot easier. This is one of the examples which I mentioned a lot, which is just adding a bot or a GitHub app, which is in this case a bot, to add a label to all new issues. Now you could also set this label up as a issue template, but a lot of times people don't open up issue templates. So if you want to apply this label to all issues, no matter what, you can do so as a bot. And I do have some code here where I have a mutation. Now, I've only talked about queries up until this point, but mutations are things like post request. And I have a mutation to basically add a label to every time a issue is opened. I'm using a webhook, which is issues.labeled. So every time an issue, context add label. It shouldn't be. It should be issues.opened. My codes are off, but anyway, I have a webhook. It should say issues.opened, but every time it gets opened, it should add a label to needs response. I'm curious where that code came from and why this webhook is off, but you can see the add label GraphQL annotation above. I add that to my query. Thanks to OctoKit is a tool it's an SDK to consume consume the GitHub API. I'm able to just pass in that mutation directly to OctoKit, and it knows what to do with the GraphQL. So there's a lot of tools out there. I do recommend the best way to learn these is not by listening to me and mention all of them, but it's just build a project and you'll eventually find some of these things. I'm happy to answer questions if you have a specific project. You can also mention me on issues. I don't mind. I might take a couple days to respond because I have a lot of stuff I've mentioned on, but I'm happy to take a look at your code as well. This is an example of a query that I'm using. And this, again, before was a mutation, so I'm actually manipulating data. This is, again, me just receiving data. But I wanted to find out all contributors in all my repos inside of an organization. And this is a query I put together just to sort of see if I could do it. So it is a kind of a longer query. I've actually have a bunch of bigger queries than this, but what I'm getting at is all this is possible by just using one query in GraphQL. Now, normally this would be probably 4 or 5 different API requests from a REST endpoint, but I'm able to accomplish this in one query in GraphQL. And I could copy and paste this and show you, but for the sake of time, we'll move right along. So I also want to point out that GitHub API is constantly getting new interactions. So follow the GitHub changelog. We have a developer changelog that tells you when things are changing, when you're getting new features. I'm looking forward to GitHub discussions getting their API endpoint exposed, so I can start doing some cool stuff with that. I also want to point out I wanted to point out another example of an integration that we use internally at GitHub, which we actually validate any PRs that have GraphQL changes and make recommendations on name changes and validate stuff like that. That's an internal tool, but if you wanted something similar, Apollo, which is, again, another company that consumes GraphQL APIs has very similar functionalities with their paid product, which I don't know. They keep changing the name. Apollo Studio was the last name I heard. I haven't used it. It used to be called Apollo Engine, but you can definitely check it out pretty quickly. And then I don't think I have a ton of time to talk about OneGraph, but OneGraph is an excellent tool that I should have showed you how I built all these other projects. All these other projects are built on top of OneGraph because it gets me into authentication, gives me persistent queries. If you want to learn about persistent queries, Swix has a great talk. He has a great talk and he has a great blog post about it as well. And the quote which is, imagine walking into a diner and saying, I'll have the usual. That's what a persistent query is. Like if you already have the data you're going to want and you want it cached, they're just going to give you the same. Like if you go into a diner every day and ask for a sandwich, like they're going to give you the same sandwich. They know you're going to ask for that and they'll revalidate that too as well. So moving along, I do live streaming on Twitch. That's why BW Live exists. And I talked about it up front because I wasn't sure how much time I can get to it. But again, built with OneGraph and Relay, and we actually talked about this in up front too as well. But this is the context of how it works. And finally, just wanted to show, I do have a YouTube channel. You just search for BW, you'll find it. I will post a tutorial on how I built BW Live. And so that way, if you're interested, I have a template that I'll be sharing. Actually, I have it shared in my Discord already. So folks who are part of my open source Discord, they have access to the template today. It's in the free stuff channel. I mentioned this because I will publish a video hopefully in the next few weeks. So if you do want to get more hands-on and see the walkthrough and a slower expository example, I will have it soon. So coming soon. And with that, reminder, GitHub Universe happening next week. Free event, tons of information. We have got free workshops too as well. And a lot of events actually happening this week too as well. So please check that out. And yeah, with that being said, I'd love to answer questions. I can answer GitHub questions, API questions, GitHub Universe questions. But yeah, please don't be shy.
Thank you, Brian, for that wonderful presentation. That was really awesome. I didn't know you were such a Beyonce fan. That is awesome as well. And
excellent.
Yeah. All right. So in the absence of questions, I think it would be great to say thank you, Brian, for having time for us and sharing this wonderful presentation, sharing GraphQL and how to build integrations with it. It's been amazing. It's been very insightful, and hopefully we can have you again some other time. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks everyone for attending this wonderful workshop. See you soon.